Okay, now we're going to hit on a topic here that I think is a good one. Reparations are all the talk now. There's a number of states who are talking about we need to find some way to pay money to the people who were slaves and to make reparations for what was done to them. And so I'm going to look at that topic, but I'm of course going to look at it from a biblical viewpoint. And you're going to find out that the biblical viewpoint is completely different than what's going on in society. So and I'll start by saying I don't think that anyone who's involved in this fight for reparations cares about what the Bible says. These are not people who are motivated by the Bible. They are people who are motivated by other things. And so this whole talk is not going to be of interest to any of those people. It's really going to focus on what the Bible says about these kinds of things. And the Bible does talk about this. It talks about enslaving free men being a wrong thing, and in fact, not just wrong, but deserving of the death penalty. And so just grabbing a person off the street and enslaving them is a biblical offense that is a possible result of execution. And the Bible talks about reparations for past wrongdoing. And we actually touched on those verses last week in what we're talking on, but I had trimmed them down a little bit just to pull out the point that I was looking at last week. And this week we'll dig into all of the verses there and see exactly what God says about reparations and the example that he sets up for us with the Gibeonites. So the Bible does address this reparations from both ends, from the part of enslaving a free person and reparations for doing that. So the first question we're going to start with is what laws of man were broken? And then we're going to talk about what laws of God were broken. And this is a key thing. I actually saw this yesterday on a business news channel that I watch. And they said, why haven't we answered the first question, which is what's the offense that we're trying to do reparations for? What was done wrong to these people? And the truth is, nothing was done wrong to them according to the laws of that time. And so at that time, having slaves was not against the laws of man. There were lots of countries who had it. It wasn't just America. Slavery had been practiced for thousands of years before, and not just slavery of black people, slavery of white people, of all sorts of other people. And sometimes the black people were the ones who were enslaving the other people. And so slavery has been around for a very long time. And at the time that the slaves were grabbed who were taken to the U.S. and sold as slaves there, slavery was not illegal. There wasn't any crime involved there. And so that's that part of it. And there were also no international laws at that time. So if you were to sneak into a country and grab somebody, that country would say, hey, you can't do that. But if you have a boat and you can jump on the boat and take that person away, they had no power. There was no international laws that governed these sorts of things. So unless the nation could defend itself from these kinds of attacks of grabbing their people, then there was no way to do that. And so there really wasn't a legal framework for dealing with these things. The only way you could deal with these things is that you would try to chase after and kill the people who had done this yourself. And so there weren't any international laws governing this. And this is exactly what happened in the case of the blacks who were enslaved and taken to America, is that they were grabbed from Africa and brought on ships and taken here. So we're talking about raiding another nation for that. And so because they were a weak nation, they didn't have military forces, they didn't have anything who could defend the people from these kind of attacks. The slavers went to those weak nations and grabbed their people, and they couldn't defend themselves. So while that might not be what anybody would want, there weren't any laws governing any of these things. There weren't any international laws that applied, and there weren't any laws of mankind at that time. Slavery was still legal. And so the answer to that question is no laws of man were broken. And that's a very hard thing to accept by a lot of people. They think of all the bad things about slavery, but grabbing people and making them slaves wasn't against the law at that time. So now we'll look at what laws of God were broken, if any. And we've talked about before that God doesn't have a problem with having slaves. You can see that all through the Old Testament and even in the New Testament. There is no evidence that God has a problem with people being slaves. But we're talking about a particular kind or particular kinds of slavery. And one of them was when people would sell themselves as slaves because typically they had gotten into too much debt And so they needed to pay the debt in some way, and the way to pay that was to make yourself a slave. Or sometimes it would actually mean selling a son or a daughter to be a slave. And so selling people to become slaves was entirely accepted at that time. And God never says anything against that. In fact, he only sets up rules to regulate that activity. And so another way that you could become a slave is a military captive. So if your armies were overthrown, then they would often grab people from the battlefield or from the towns that had been conquered and make them slaves. And that was really a better opportunity than the opposite, because the opposite would have been that they would just kill all those people. So instead of killing the people, they would enslave some of the people. And that's also a very standard thing that's seen in the Bible in lots of places. So God wasn't against that, against having slaves, and as long as they were acquired in the proper way. But God is very much against snatching free people and enslaving them. And we're going to look at the verses on that in just a little bit here. And so these people who were stolen, that is a problem with God. And so a law of God was broken here, definitely, and we'll see that. Now, generally what laws were broken. If you reject God's word, as I've been talking about here, as society has really done in this whole reparations discussion, then everything done was legal. There's no reason to expect any reparations because no crime was ever committed. Nothing was done wrong. And unfortunately, what's trying to be done here is we're trying to judge people in the past by our current laws, and there's no justice in that. You can't do that. You can't use modern laws to judge people in the past, but that's what they're trying to do. And that's a con, really. It's a deceitful thing to try and do. But if you do accept God's word, then there really was a crime, and a reparation is due, and God's word shows us how to handle that reparation. So we're going to start digging into what the reparation is and the example that God provides in the Old Testament. And we need to talk a little bit about justice systems, because there's two different justice systems involved here. And you kind of saw that in the two past slides. Some say it's unjust for people who were never slaves to be rewarded from people who were never slave owners. And that's a phrase that you'll commonly see used here. And that is the way our justice system works. Our justice system does not support the idea that a child would be made to suffer the consequences of a father's crimes. And so that's really all that they're saying when they say that is it's an unjust thing to do for people who were never slaves to benefit from people who were never slave owners. But the Bible perspective on this, so that's our legal justice system, but the Bible's perspective on that is different, and it says that there are consequences that do fall on the children, and we know that just from fact. A bad father, if he wastes the money of the family, then the family suffers because of that waste. And so the actions of the father do have consequences that fall on the children. And that's just natural. And we also will see that it can be worse than that in some cases. And so what God has said in the Bible is that he wants our judicial systems to deal with what they can and to do it justly. It needs to be just, which means fair to everyone. And so God does have an interest here, but his interest is kind of in a select area. He wants us to do our own just judicial systems that we can handle these crimes ourselves. And he prefers to stay out of the picture most of the time when the justice systems that we have can work. But he has an interest in getting involved where the judicial systems cannot work. And that's what we saw last week, and we'll see again here. There was a case where King Saul did some things and he got away with it because he was king. There was no judicial system that could judge him, but God stepped in and corrected that and brought in a reparation for that. And as I said, we'll look at those verses. So the idea of stealing a man or kidnapping a person, and I'm going to explain why I'm using the word stealing a man here in just a second. So the first reference on kidnapping comes from Exodus 21, so that's right after Exodus 20 where the Ten Commandments are. And these are examples that God is giving of special cases and how you would judge those cases based on the Ten Commandments. So it says, 21:16 says, no one who kidnaps someone, whether he sells him or is found in his possession, shall certainly be put to death. Okay, so he says, if you kidnap somebody, it doesn't matter if you sold him or if he's still with you, you're going to be put to death for that crime, and you should be. And then in Deuteronomy 24, it brings up the same idea. It expands on it a little bit, and so it's worthy, although it's largely a duplicate. If someone is caught kidnapping any of his countrymen of the sons of Israel, and he treats him as merchandise and sells him, then that thief shall die. So you shall eliminate the evil from among you. So that one makes it really clear. He says it talks about your countrymen and sons of Israel. And so it is specifically there. It doesn't talk about the case of somebody else. And the case where you would kidnap from another country is typically the one that I talked about, a military conquest. So the word kidnap here in this translation in English, in Hebrew, is actually the word that we translate as steal. So they would say if someone is caught stealing any of his countrymen, and so it's kind of, it may seem a little odd to us to think of kidnapping as stealing, but it's really important to understand that this is an eighth commandment violation, and so kidnapping is stealing a person, and that's how the Ten Commandments are linked to this kidnapping of a person. And so that puts it right up there in seriousness with murder. So it's just like murder, and that's why the crime is this person should be put to death for stealing a person. But we also need to understand a little bit more about the word steal or the word from Hebrew that's being translated in English as steal. And it really doesn't mean exactly what we mean with steal. When we think of stealing, we think of you grab something and take it away from you, but with you. But that's not really what steal means in Hebrew. It means to put your hand on something. And so what it means is to take control of that. So a person can steal stuff from you in ways that we don't really think of. And one of them is actually kind of coming into play in our society now. And so someone can take control of your things. So what the people in the future want to be able to do is they would let you buy a lawnmower if they felt that you needed a lawnmower. And if you did buy a lawnmower, then they would tell you when you could mow your lawn. So that kind of socialism is somebody in control of your things. So they've actually put their hand on, they're controlling your things. And so that's what stealing in Hebrew includes, in addition to just taking stuff away. It means controlling stuff that doesn't belong to you. And so you can be a thief without ever taking something out of someone else's possession. So, and another thing here that's a little odd is the word kidnap. It isn't talking just about children, although originally that's what the word was talking about. It was kidnapping, as you might imagine, means talking about kids. But now kidnapping, the word is used to refer to not just kids, but now any person, an adult as well. So the whole kidnapping translation is not my favorite way of doing it, but we just don't have a better word for doing that in our culture. Okay, so that's the Old Testament. The New Testament also brings up this topic, and this is Paul talking to Timothy in 1 Timothy. And from chapter 1, 8 through 10, he talks about a whole bunch of evil things that people do and that are wrong, and the church shouldn't be doing that. Church people shouldn't be doing that. But we know that the law, the Torah, is good if a man will be led by it according to the law, while he knows that the law, it was not appointed for the righteous, but for the evil, the rebellious, the wicked, the sinners, for the vicious, for those who are impure, for those who strike their fathers, those who strike their mothers, for murderers, for fornicators, for males who lie down with males, for kidnappers of free men, for liars, for oath breakers, and for all things opposed to the sound teaching. So what he's done here is he said the law is good for a person to follow if he will be led by it according to the law. And so he says it's good for a man, but the man it's intended for is an unrighteous man. And so it's appointed for the unrighteous to see their evil. And he says, but for the evil, and then he lists all of these different evils that people do. And one of them is kidnappers of free men. Now, again, we're having a bit of a translation problem. Literally, in the text, the translation would be thieves of children of freedom. But that really means the same thing. It means taking a free person and grabbing them, taking control of them, and making them a slave in some fashion. And that wouldn't literally need to be that you had them in your possession. Nonetheless, you would have done that. So everyone except a slave is a child of freedom in this thing. Child of freedom or child of anything is a common reference in the New Testament. That's the way they would talk about people who were followers of other people or people who followed rules of a particular sort. So you could be a child of the law if you were actually what we would call a student of the law. And so this is just a way of describing things at that time. And so it really does mean the same thing. It's talking about kidnappers of free people. So they were free men before, and you grabbed them up and made them into a slave. You took control of them. So the Bible definitely speaks about that, Old Testament and New Testament, about the problem of grabbing a free person. And in the Old Testament, it actually talks about what the penalty would be for that. And so now we have the case of reparations. And a lot of these verses, as I said before, are going to be what we talked about last week, but in a different context. And so this is coming from 2 Samuel chapter 21. It says, "Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year, and David sought the presence of the Lord. And the Lord said, It is because of Saul and his bloody house, because he put the Gibeonites to death. So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the sons of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. And the sons of Israel had made a covenant with them, but Saul had sought to kill them in his zeal for the sons of Israel and Judah." So Saul didn't want these people who were non-Israelites to be in the land of Israel. So he was going to just wipe them out and kill all of them. And he set about to do that, but didn't obviously succeed about that. But he did that despite the fact that there was an agreement between Israel and the Gibeonites that they would be able to stay, that the Gibeonites could stay in the land of Israel. And so Saul violated that agreement and sought to kill all of these people. Continuing on, so David said to the Gibeonites, "What should I do for you, and how can I make amends, so that you will bless the inheritance of the Lord?" Then the Gibeonites said to him, "For us it is not a matter of silver or gold with Saul or his house." Okay, now that's an important thing, and we're going to come back to it. They're saying it is not a matter of silver or gold. We don't want money. We don't want anything like that. And it says, and that's not their purpose. They don't think that that would be a way to set this whole business straight. So what they say, continuing on, is, "Nor is it for us to put anyone to death in Israel. We don't have the authority to execute anyone for that, as a person like this should be done." And nevertheless, David said, "I will do for you whatever you say." So they're saying we have no authority to put anyone to death, and we don't want any money. And so David says, "Okay, fine, I will do for you whatever you say." And so they said to the king, "The man who destroyed us and who planned to eliminate us so that we would not exist within the border of Israel, let 7 men from his sons be given to us, and we will hang them before the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of the Lord." And the king said, "I will give them." So they've chosen 7 men. Despite the fact that hundreds of their people were killed, they've chosen 7, and we'll come back to that as well. So what are the steps here that we see in this reparation? So this is a reparation. God has brought it up. He said to King David, "We need to deal with this. Now is the time to deal with this. I want you to go to these people and work out a deal so that this whole matter can be settled." And so the beginning step is God says it's time to clear the debt. This is the appropriate time. It wasn't appropriate before. Now it's appropriate, and it can be dealt with now. And so God is the one who says when. And the next step is that the king takes action. So the head of the country takes action to begin to clear this debt. And the third step of that is the representatives of the aggrieved people choose what seems just to them. So there's 2 factors there. There are representatives of these aggrieved people. There are leaders of the Gibeonites who can speak for the Gibeonites and who represent them. And whatever deal they come up with, the Gibeonites are going to follow and accept that deal. And that will come up again later as well. So the representatives of the aggrieved people choose what seems just to them. And so it's their choice. King David says, "Okay, what works for you? Tell me what'll do for you." And they say, as I pointed out there, in this case, they had no interest in money. Gold and silver, we don't care about. And they said, "We have no authority to do anything else." And David said, "Okay, what would make you happy?" And what they wanted was they wanted life for life, but in a reasonable way. They didn't say, "You killed 300 of our people, and so we want to kill 300 of your people." Instead, they chose 7 as the number of people who would pay for this. And 7, and you know that is the number for perfect completion. So completed perfectly. So the number 7 here, living in Israel, they obviously understood the meaning of 7. And so they say that this would be the right number to use. It's a symbolic number. It says that this is going to put an end to it. We're going to complete this whole business through the deaths of these people. So this is going to be a perfect completion to this matter. And they wanted the lives of only Saul's family, no one else. They weren't saying, "Oh, all you Israelites are guilty, just like Saul's guilty, and so these 7 people should come from all the people of Israel. No, they said this was Saul's doing, and we want it to come from Saul's family. And so they've done very reasonable things here. They've chosen a reasonable, meaningful number, and they've also not selected people generally who weren't involved in this and had no ability to do anything in it. And they chose Saul's family because Saul is the one who started this and caused it to happen. Without him, it wouldn't have happened. So those are all things that we're going to see again being later as we understand this more. So so the next step in this is the king determines whether their choice is reasonable. And so he says, yeah, okay, I see what you're doing with choosing 7, and that makes sense. And so he says, fine, we'll do that. It's a reasonable solution to this matter. And so it's kind of expected like that because God is the one who said, now is the time to clear that debt. And so if it's time to clear the debt, then almost certainly the people who are going to be the one choosing the reparation are also ready to do a reasonable reparation, and therefore that's what the king receives and accepts. So the last step is the king gives them what they want, and the whole matter is settled forever. It's done with. Nobody's ever going to bring this up again. You don't see it mentioned ever again in the Bible. It's over and done with because of this reparation. So I want to touch on one thing that's interesting. Why reject money? Why choose an execution of people instead of taking money? They said they had no interest in silver and gold. And the Bible doesn't say why they chose execution over money. They said that specifically, but we can think about that ourselves and see that there's a lot of problems with using money as a reparation. And I have a list here, and these are probably not all of them. These are just the ones that I thought of. The problem with money as a reparation, or one problem, is a large amount of money, when divided among a large number of people, becomes an insignificant amount per person. And so maybe you got $50 reparation for the killing of hundreds of your people. Well, that doesn't seem, it's an insignificant amount. It's not a life-changing amount of money. And so a large amount of money, when you divide it among a large number of people, becomes so insignificant that people wouldn't see it as a reparation. And so, but if you go the other direction and you say, well, if you give a significant amount of money for every person, then that becomes an unreasonable amount in total. And it becomes something that the king couldn't find as being reasonable. And so, and another problem with that is if you give a significant amount of money to anyone, it's soon wasted. It only promotes waste and corruption, honestly, because what people will do when they get a sudden pile of money. And we know that from our own lotteries. There's a whole bunch of lottery winners out there who are now poverty stricken because they started doing things and spending their money foolishly and got into that habit and couldn't get out and wasted their whole lives. So money is bad for all those reasons, but money is also bad for other reasons. Money comes, money goes, but everybody remembers an execution. And so what I mean there by that is that even if you got a significant amount of money, once you had spent it, it would be gone, and you wouldn't think about it anymore because it was just completely gone. And you would lose it from memory. You'd forget that there was ever any money because money comes in your life, money goes out of your life all the time. It's just the flow of money through your life. And so this would just be a little bump in that flow of money. But everybody remembers an execution like this. So the execution of these 7 people is going to stick in the minds of people. It's going to be a constant reminder. Everybody will say, yes, this was something that happened that was different than everything else, and there was a reason for it. And so it's going to be something that people are going to recall in the future. And if it ever comes up, hey, you Israelites killed a bunch of us Gibeonites, then you can always say, well, remember that execution? That was what settled the debt. So money doesn't do that. Money doesn't settle anything. It's just something that comes and goes and is soon forgotten. And another problem with money is that money puts a value on life. And so what value are you going to use for the life of a person? Well, the natural value you would use here is the price of a slave, but that's kind of a slap in the face. So you wouldn't want to use that. And so one of the big problems is using money as a reparation is that you don't know what value is the right value to use. There's no guidance, there's no thinking about that. And if you make it too small, it makes it sound like you're cheap, making life cheap. And if you make it too large, then it's too large for anybody to handle. And so that's another problem with money, is choosing the right value to properly assess the crime and repair for the crime. And also tied to that money is, how do you distribute the money? And this is also a big problem in our time, the people who are considering reparations in our time. In their time, of Israel, how would you count the people killed? Because a lot of the people were killed and their entire families and towns were wiped out. And so how would you get a valid number for how many people were killed? And also, how would you count who should benefit from this? If you're going to try to spread this money around, which people should get it and which people should not get it? And that's a big problem, as I said, with the current reparation ideas. So um, the money as a reparation has all of these problems and probably others too. But the execution is a better solution in that it is something that is symbolic. It's not something that everybody comes to own. You don't have to divide it up among a bunch of people, but it makes a symbolic statement that people are going to remember. It says these people were killed because we were killed. It was done as a reparation for what was done to us. And so the execution that is chosen by the Gibeonites is a much better solution. And money is a poor solution, always. So I'm going to just glance on something here. This is the grievances listed in the California report. If you've been following the news, a group was set up in California who would determine what should be the reparations, and they looked at all the different things that needed to be corrected for. And so here's their list of chapters, and I'm just going to quickly go through this. Chapter 2 of the book, chapter 1 is just an introduction. Chapter 2 says enslavement, and we know, yes, God says enslavement is wrong, and so that original grabbing of the slaves, that was wrong. Now, chapter 3, racial terror. Well, what is that? Chapter 4, political disenfranchisement. Well, who can measure that? Housing segregation. Well, how does free housing and segregation mean anything? Separate and unequal education. Well, how do you measure that? Racism in environment and infrastructure. Pathologizing the African American family. Well, that was another grievance. That isn't even a thing to most people. Control over creative, cultural, and intellectual life. Well, that's even disputable, even if you understand it. Stolen labor and hindered opportunity. Well, again, how do you measure this? An unjust legal system. Well, who even claims that? The system has never been unjust. It's always treated, well, almost always. There was a period of time when it was unjust that way, but that's long gone. Um, Mental and physical harm and neglect and the wealth gap. And so that's really just saying there's a gap in the wealth, and therefore white people must be responsible for that, and they need to pay reparations for that. And so the whole California report is just a list of grievances of things. Well, we don't like this. And to be honest, as I said before, it's kind of a con job. This is an attempt to get governments to pay what courts would never cause to be paid. And so it's an effort to find somebody that you can con into doing this. And it's also an effort to throw away any responsibility from Black people for their own systems, their own problems, and to try and place it on the shoulders of other people. And so this is about as bad as it can get for reparations in our time. So what does reparation in our time look like biblically? And so we're going to use the story of David and the Gibeonites that we just read from as a template and say, well, if God said that this is the right time, what would we do? And so the first question we're going to look at is this the right time? And that's kind of a key thing. If this isn't the right time, then it shouldn't even be going forward. It's not going to succeed if this is not the right time. And so how do we know this is the right time? Has God stepped in and said it's the right time? No. And so no one in the reparations debate is interested in the right time. They think anytime we can get money is the right time. So the next question is there a reparation that will be accepted by all people as being just? And we'll look at that question. Is there a representative of all of the injured people? Remember with the Gibeonites, there were leaders of the Gibeonites who got together and talked to the king, and they said, this is what we'll do. And because they were the leader of the Gibeonites, they could tell all the Gibeonites, this is what's being done, and all the Gibeonites would accept that. And there isn't any representative of the injured people at all right now. And so they have no representative that they would follow and obey and accept their decisions. And another thing about reparation is reparation always needs to be targeted against the descendants of the people who broke the law. And remember, that's what the Gibeonites did. They said, it's going to be Saul's family who pay this debt. They're going to be the ones who put up the 7 people who are going to be executed. And that's a just thing. You can't target people who had nothing to do with it. Now, I'm speaking of man systems, of course, here. So in our own legal systems, you can't target people who are innocent. And you also need to look at the benefit side that way. It needs to benefit only the descendants of the people who were injured. And if you benefit other people, then that's unjust. And so both of those have to be kept in balance. You need to make sure that you aren't targeting innocent people and not benefiting people who were uninjured. So going through all these questions, we're going to look at, is this the right time? And remember our context here. We're talking about God's word. We're not talking about the laws of the country, really. Although, of course, it would be done in some context of our laws, I imagine. And so only the kidnapping counts here because that's the only real offense. There was no legal offense in man's courts. The only offense is in God's, and that was grabbing a free man and making him into a slave. And so only those kidnappings can be counted. And that's not what the current groups want to do. They want to count everything else after that. And as I said before, God has not said it's the time, and it plainly isn't. You only have to look at what's going on. There are a bunch of race hustlers out there stirring up trouble to try and make money. And so a lot of these groups are trying to get money to come in for this, and they would keep it themselves in these groups, and they wouldn't give it to any of the people. And so that's part of the distribution problem that you have with money as well, is making sure that it gets to the people who are actually injured. And so no one is suggesting reasonable reparation measures. No one is talking about something that would be a reasonable solution. The only solutions that we're seeing is very large per person numbers that result into astronomical numbers that no one could afford in any state. And so there are no reasonable reparations being suggested, and any reasonable reparation that you might make as a suggestion would be rejected immediately by these groups because they're not really interested in doing a reparation. They're just trying to get money. And so this is not the time. There is nobody here who is ready to make a deal that's going to be just for everyone. So any attempt right now, because this is the wrong time, to implement some sort of unreasonable reparation measure is going to result in a race war. It's going to just make things worse between blacks and whites and others, and it's going to make everybody feeling like they were cheated. Those who got money won't feel like they got enough, and those who lost money are going to feel like they weren't responsible for anything, and so nothing should have affected them. And so it's just going to result in unhappiness because the time isn't right. And also the next thing is a just reparation. What is a just reparation here? And we talked about money being a really poor reparation because of all those problems that I went through. And so, but we know that a solution involving execution is not possible. There's no justice system that's going to allow execution of people who are living now for a crime committed by their forefathers, even if you can identify who the people were who had forefathers who grabbed these slaves. And so we can't do an execution, and a monetary solution is really a bad idea. No one's going to be happy with it. Even the California report recognizes these problems, and they talk about other solutions. Well, could you do an apology? Well, an apology kind of runs flat. Apologies are cheap and easy. Or maybe you could do a monument. If you set up some sort of a monument to this, maybe that would be a solution that would make people happy. Well, a lot of these groups are really in it for the money, and all they want is money. And so these solutions aren't being talked about as being real solutions. So, and they have the big problem with reparation is that no one is speaking for all of these people who were the injured. And so some of these people would opt out or change their minds, and they would say, well, I thought that was going to be enough money, but now I decided it's not enough money, and I want more money. Or maybe they'll say, well, the laws haven't changed, and we're still being treated unjustly, and so I want more money. So unless you have leaders of the injured, people who can speak for the injured and actually lead them and tell them this is going to be the reparation that ends everything, then it doesn't end. It's going to just keep on going on. So targeting people who broke the law. I talked about that in short terms, but we need to talk about that a little bit more. So who broke the law here? It would be the people who did the kidnapping, okay? And it might be, although this could be questionable, the people who bought the kidnapped people from those who kidnapped them. And so you'd have to ask, did these people who were buying slaves from the slave ships know how these slaves had been kidnapped and that they weren't proper slaves? And would they have even cared about that? It's not sure whether the people who bought slaves would have to be part of the group who would be targeted here. But certainly the ones who grabbed the slaves originally are the ones who broke God's law. And what you need to do is, when you target these people, is you need to make sure that only the descendants of these people, and only to the degree that they're descended from these people, is how they should be targeted. And so now you get into a really big problem. You have to get into genetics and say, well, okay, your great grandfather on that side there was one of the slave ship owners, and so he would be guilty for that. But your other three great grandfathers weren't. They had nothing to do with slavery. So you are 25% accountable for that. And so you've got a massive task. You would have to go through and identify all of these people, and you'd have to go down to genetics and do all of these things like this. And so the whole idea becomes kind of impossible to do because it's just too complicated. You would spend more money trying to define and decide who these people were, who did wrong, who were the descendants of those who did wrong, and all the money that you would have given to the people would go to just finding out who the people were that should have been targeted. And so identifying the descendants is nearly impossible because it's been such a very long time and records weren't kept like that. And similarly with benefiting the injured, only the descendants of slaves, and only to the degree they were descended from slaves, are the people who should be benefit from the whatever this reparation is going to be. And so you have exactly the same problem. You would have to identify which of the black people were the ones who came from slaves, and to what degree. Did they have maybe two slaves as grandparents on one side, but the other grandparents aren't because they came into the country through normal processes? And so you, on the same problem occurs on this side of deciding who are the people who should benefit, and you have to get into genetics and find out who actually descended from slaves, because not all of the black people in this country descended from slaves. And so again, a nearly impossible problem to get to resolve, identifying the injured and also identifying those people who are the criminals, who should be the ones who should be punished. So we're getting close to the end here. Not that everyone in the Bible, in the reparations movement, cares about the Bible, and I don't think anyone in the reparations movement cares about the Bible or what it says. But the Bible does talk about handling little grievances like this, all of these things about somebody mistreating you. And so I've got a couple of quotes here from Matthew 5, both of them. One is verses 39 through 41, and it says, "But I am saying to you, you shall not rise up against an evil person, but whoever strikes you on your right cheek, turn to him also the other. And whoever wants to sue you and take your coat, leave for him also your cloak. Whoever compels you to go 1 mile with him, go with him 2 miles." And so the message there is, don't rise up against an evil person. There are going to be people who do evil things to you. And if it's the kind of an evil where there is no court to prosecute that, which was much more the case back in Jesus' time. They didn't have courts like ours who would prosecute somebody for slapping another person. But we now have that as an offense in our courts. And so these things of a person abusing you or saying nasty things to you, those weren't things that you could take to court and at that time. And so Jesus is saying, if these people do these things to you that you couldn't take them to court for, then just take it. You have to accept that and show them that they're wrong. Go beyond what they insist that you do, and exceed in that, and show them that you are a good person, that you are not an evil person like they are. And Matthew 5:44 says much the same thing. It says, "But I say to you, love your enemies and bless the one who curses you, and do what is beautiful to the one who hates you, and pray over those who take you by force and persecute you." And so, same message there. There are people who are evil in society, and they're going to do things to you. They're going to curse you. They're going to hate you, and they're going to pray over. They're going to need to be prayed over by you, and even if they persecute you. And so that really sets the pattern of not getting back, not rising up against evil people, not becoming an evil person yourself, not returning evil for evil, but pray for them. And so that's the way to deal with this. But of course, nobody in the reparations movement now cares about these verses or these ideas. They're all determined that these offenses. I didn't mention one that's in that list from California. In environmental injustices. So we all know that arithmetic is racist, and we all know that roads are racist now, and so that's what they're talking about there. So things like this, if they're even something mean done to you, are not something you can prosecute for, and the Bible's guidance on that is just take it. You haven't any other recourse. So summarizing all of this, the Gibeonites apparently understood the problems of the financial solution. We don't see them talking about why they said silver or gold we don't want, but that's what their decision was. And we dug into that, and we understand all of the problems, or some of the problems, that you would get with a financial solution. A financial solution of dividing money up among people becomes a solution that's almost impossible to achieve justice. And so in our case, God says some people are due reparation. And so the people who were grabbed from Africa are certainly, there was an evil done to them in God's eye, and something should be done as a reparation for that. But not nearly as many people should benefit from that as they think. And so they're trying to put a whole lot more stuff on there that aren't crimes, never were crimes, still aren't crimes. And so we aren't ready. This is not the right time. This whole fight about this is still going on. And until it settles down, there wouldn't be a time when a reparation could be done that would be just. And so what we've also seen here is that there isn't a solution that's going to be seen as just by both sides right now. There will be no agreement on any solution because we're that far apart in how we view it. And there isn't a leader for the injured. And I talked about that quite a bit, and it's worth rehashing that a little bit. For a reparation to succeed, the people who receive the reparation must see that as the end of the matter, and it should never ever come up again. And that's not where we are. They don't have a leader who can lead them and instruct them in that and achieve that goal. And so any reparation that might be done now is not going to be the end of it. It's always going to be seen by the people who got the money as the first thing, and then there's going to be the next thing. And so that having a leader of the injured party is important here to make sure that justice is achieved. And there isn't a solution that will bring the grievances to a close. There is no solution here, as I kind of said earlier. And closing this is what the reparation is about. The reparation is something that you do to make up for what was done in the past, to clear the slate, and now you can move forward. And David says he wants them to bless Israel, and so that's what the goal is to achieve a closure on this. But right now we have no ability to do that. There's not going to be any closure with anything that people are talking about right now. Any questions?
Stan, before you
Yep.
go there, I want to just say just a word or two about the subject. I was listening to this black gentleman, but I don't know what his name is, but it doesn't really matter. And he said something that we never thought about, but I think you kind of alluded to it, and that was that he said he believes that if reparations to blacks for slavery goes through, he says there will be a race war. And I thought, that doesn't make any sense. And what he was saying was, he was quoting this book called Black Masters, The Ownerships of Slaves by Free People of Color. So he said, I know my family members from way back in the day, they owned black slaves too. But now they weren't the only ones, there was a lot of them.
Mm-hmm.
So he says, my question to anybody that brings up the subject is, oh, do we have to do reparations too? The black people have to do it too? And he said, and if they don't, then white people are going to say that's not fair, and so it'll be a race war.
Yep.
So, and I think he's right about that.
Oh yes, yeah. I actually did use the words race war in this presentation, and that is what would happen. Is that relationships between blacks and whites would only get worse. It would not get better. It would heal nothing.